There is something quietly heartbreaking about a magnificent railway station left to silence. Imagine vast iron and glass vaulted ceilings echoing with nothing but pigeons, ornate stone facades blackened by decades of neglect, grand clocks frozen in time. Across Britain, Europe, and beyond, hundreds of Victorian and Edwardian railway stations, structures built to project civic pride and the unstoppable power of the industrial age, now sit idle, converted to nightclubs and flea markets, or simply abandoned behind wire fences. Meanwhile, passengers pack into bland, functional interchange hubs a mile away, shuffling between concrete platforms under fluorescent lights. The question almost every rail enthusiast and casual traveler asks is the same: why don't the railways simply use these beautiful buildings? The stations are already there, the infrastructure exists, the locations, by definition, are exactly where railways need to be. Yet railway operators and governments routinely decline to restore and reactivate them, routing lines around or beneath them, or leaving them to developers who turn them into anything but train stations. The answer, it turns out, is layered across engineering constraints, staggering financial realities, regulatory labyrinths, and a fundamental shift in how and why people travel. Monuments to a different age of travel. To understand why historic stations are so difficult to integrate into modern rail networks, it helps to understand why they were built the way they were in the first place. Victorian and Edwardian railway stations were not designed as neutral infrastructure. They were designed as declarations. When a town gained a railway terminus in the mid to late 19th century, the station was expected to serve as the grandest building in the city, after perhaps the cathedral and the town hall. Railway companies were flush with investor capital and fiercely competitive with one another. A magnificent station was a marketing tool, a promise of prosperity, and a demonstration of permanence. These stations were also designed around the operational realities of steamer travel. Trains were shorter. A typical express of the 1880s might consist of 8 to 10 carriages, each considerably smaller and lighter than a modern vehicle. Journeys were slower, dwell times at stations were longer, and the relationship between passenger, platform, and train was fundamentally different. Travelers arrived early, checked luggage with porters, took refreshments in dining rooms, and waited in first, second, or third-class lounges depending on their social standing. Platforms were wide because they accommodated a whole ecosystem of human activity. Station buildings were deep because they housed all of this ancillary function: waiting rooms, telegraph offices, book stalls, left luggage halls, and more. The track layouts reflected similar priorities. Curves were sharp by modern standards because trains moved slowly enough that this posed no problem. Platforms were often terminal. Trains pulled in, reversed out, or stood for extended periods while locomotives were changed or watered. The geometry of a 19th century station was optimized for a world where a 20-minute stop was unremarkable. It was, in short, a completely different operational universe from the one that modern railways inhabit. The technical mismatch. When old bones cannot bear new demands, the most fundamental reason historic stations are bypassed is simply that their physical dimensions are incompatible with modern trains. A contemporary high-speed or even standard intercity train can run to 400 meters in length. Victorian platforms were rarely designed to accommodate anything close to this. A platform built for a train of 8 short coaches in 1885 might be barely a third of the length needed for a modern 12-car electric multiple unit. The platform cannot simply be extended at the far end in many cases because the space beyond the historic canopy or station wall is occupied by roads, buildings, or other infrastructure that has grown up around the old terminus over more than a century. Even where extension is technically possible, the geometry of the approach tracks creates its own problems. Many historic stations sit at the end of sharply curved approach lines, or are accessed via tight junctions designed for slow-speed maneuvering. Modern high-speed trains are long, rigid, and dynamically sensitive to curvature. Running such vehicles through tight curves at even moderate speeds creates unacceptable stresses on the track and vehicles, and generates a rough, uncomfortable ride for passengers. The result is that any train attempting to use an unmodified historic station must slow dramatically on the approach, sometimes to walking past restoring the time advantages that modern rail travel is supposed to deliver. The buildings themselves present further structural challenges. Victorian station architecture prioritized grandeur in specific places: the great tranched roof, the hotel or office frontage, the ornamental ironwork. What these buildings did not anticipate was the need for wide, step-free accessible platforms with tactile surfaces, modern signaling equipment rooms, HVAC systems, high voltage, electrical infrastructure, or the weight loadings imposed by the automatic doors and boarding systems of contemporary rolling stock. The roof of a beautiful Victorian trench may be a masterpiece of cast iron and glass, but it was not engineered to carry modern overhead. Electrical catenary wires at the voltages required for contemporary electric traction. Bringing a historic station's infrastructure up to modern operational standards is therefore not a restoration project. It is an engineering redesign project conducted inside a museum. Every intervention must account for what is already there: the geometry, the loadings, the materials, the spatial layout. Modern station design, by contrast, begins with a blank sheet and optimizes for throughput, safety, accessibility, and operational efficiency. The two approaches are not easy to reconcile. The staggering cost of working with history. If the technical obstacles alone were not sufficient to deter railway operators from rehabilitating historic stations, the financial realities quickly extinguish any remaining optimism. The cost of restoring, adapting, and maintaining a large Victorian station is not simply high, it is of an entirely different order of magnitude from what might be naively assumed. St. Pancras International in London is often cited as the gold standard of successful historic station regeneration. It is undeniably a triumph. The Gothic Revival Hotel frontage has been meticulously restored. The magnificent Barlow trainist has been refurbished and extended to accommodate Eurostar trains, and the station now serves as one of the most celebrated pieces of transport infrastructure in the world. But the price of this success was enormous. The overall regeneration program cost approximately £800 million, a figure that, adjusted for inflation and the time value of money, represents one of the most expensive infrastructure interventions ever undertaken on a single railway station. And that figure does not capture the ongoing expense. The facade of a Victorian station, built from limestone, brick, terracotta, and ornamental ironwork, requires constant specialist attention. Stonework cracks, iron corrodes, glass panels break, and ornamental details loosen over time. A major conservation exercise on a station of this scale might cost £12 million or more every decade. Money that must be found repeatedly, in perpetuity, simply to keep the building standing in its original form. This is not an investment that pays dividends. It is a maintenance liability that never ends. Beyond the visible fabric of the building lie further hidden costs that accumulate rapidly during any restoration project. Victorian construction predates modern understanding of hazardous materials. Lead paint, asbestos insulation, and contaminated ground beneath old locomotive yards are commonplace discoveries. Removal of these materials is heavily regulated, technically demanding, and expensive. Fire safety upgrades present similar challenges. Victorian buildings were designed without modern compartmentalization, sprinkler systems, or emergency evacuation routes, and retrofitting these features into a listed structure without altering its character requires extraordinary ingenuity and expense. Accessibility requirements add another layer of complexity. Modern law in most jurisdictions mandates step-free access, accessible toilets, tactile paving, hearing loops, and clear wayfinding for passengers with disabilities. A Victorian station was built at a time when none of these concepts existed. Introducing them requires lifts, ramps, and structural alterations that are architecturally disruptive and mechanically complex. Lifts in particular are expensive to install and to maintain, and in a heritage structure, their installation must be carefully designed to minimize visual impact, which adds further cost. Finally, there is the cost of the railway systems themselves. A Victorian station that is to be returned to active rail use must be equipped with modern signaling, a field that has transformed almost beyond recognition in the past 30 years. With digital systems, moving block operations, and European interoperability standards replacing the mechanical and electromechanical signaling of the past. Electrification, where required, demands the installation of overhead line, equipment, or third rail conductor systems throughout the platforms and approach tracks. These are major civil engineering projects in their own right, unrelated to the heritage aspects of the station, and they must be layered on top of all the other restoration and adaptation costs. Regulatory labyrinths. When heritage protection becomes an obstacle for railway operators considering the rehabilitation of a historic station, the financial calculations are made even more daunting by the regulatory environment surrounding listed buildings. In the United Kingdom, most significant Victorian railway stations are listed at Grade 1 or Grade 2, placing them among the most protected structures in the country. Similar protective regimes exist across Europe and in many other jurisdictions worldwide. Listed building consent, the permission required before any work that affects the character of a protected structure, is not a simple administrative formality. It triggers a complex sequence of assessments, consultations, and approvals that can extend the planning phase of a project by years. A heritage impact assessment must be prepared, documenting precisely how every proposed intervention will affect the significance of the building. Public consultations must be held, allowing residents, amenity groups, and heritage organizations to register their views. Historic England, or its equivalent body in other countries, must be consulted and may impose conditions or object to proposals. The power of objection is considerable. A single well-organized amenity society can, through the planning process, delay a major infrastructure project for years. Even if objections are ultimately unsuccessful, the time and legal cost of overcoming them can be ruinous. Railway operators, already working within tight investment budgets and pressed by government for efficiency, have little appetite for regulatory battles that may last a decade before a single brick is moved. Heritage funding, which might be expected to offset some of these costs, turns out to offer only limited relief. Grants from bodies like the National Lottery Heritage Fund or Historic England are typically sized for conservation projects, not for the industrial-scale operational upgrades that a functioning railway station requires. A grant might fund the restoration of a station's ornamental ironwork or the repair of its clock tower, but it will not fund the installation of new signaling equipment. The construction of extended platforms, or the removal of asbestos, the gap between what heritage funding covers and what operational restoration actually costs is therefore enormous, and the railway operator or developer is left to bridge it from commercial revenues or public subsidy. This creates a particularly cruel dynamic. The very protections that preserve these buildings from demolition also make them extraordinarily expensive and slow to adapt, which in turn makes railway operators less likely to want to use them. Heritage protection, intended to serve the public interest by preserving the nation's architectural legacy, can end up accelerating the functional obsolescence of the buildings it protects. The passenger has changed, speed over splendor. Even if the engineering were straightforward, the finances manageable, and the regulators cooperative, there is a deeper question about whether modern passengers actually want what a historic station has to offer. The evidence suggests that the relationship between travelers and railway stations has changed profoundly since the Victorian era, and that the values embedded in grand terminal design may no longer align with what contemporary passengers prioritize. Victorian travelers, particularly those of the middle and upper classes who could afford the better classes of travel, treated the railway journey as an event, arriving early, engaging with the full social theater of the station. The porters, the dining rooms, the bookstalls, the spectacle of steam engines was part of the experience. Time spent in the station was not dead time. It was part of a journey that had its own pace and texture. Modern passengers overwhelmingly want the opposite. They want to arrive at the last possible moment, board with minimal friction, travel quickly, and arrive precisely on time. The dwell time that was once a feature of railway travel is now experienced as a delay, a station that forces passengers to slow down, whether because of circuitous approach, routes, difficult platform access, or simply the requirement to navigate a complex historic building. Is a station that is failing its users by contemporary standards. This attitudinal shift has consequences for modal competition. Railway operators are not competing only against other train services. They are competing against private cars and increasingly against coaches, domestic aviation, and for shorter journeys, cycling and ride-hailing. Delays caused by suboptimal station design are not abstract inconveniences. They translate directly into passengers choosing alternatives. A traveler who misses a connection because the platform layout at a historic station required an unexpectedly long walk, or who arrives late because the approach to the station imposed a speed restriction, is a traveler who may opt for the motorway next time. There is also the question of what passengers expect from a station building itself. The cavernous waiting rooms and ornate refreshment saloons of the Victorian era have been replaced by coffee chains, newsagents, and fast food outlets. Passengers carrying laptops and smartphones want Wi-Fi, power sockets, and clear digital departure boards, not chandeliers and decorative tilework. The aesthetic values that make historic stations beloved by heritage, enthusiasts and casual admirers are largely irrelevant to the majority of passengers, who simply want to get on their train. Second lives. How some historic stations have survived. Not every historic station that has lost its railway function has been lost entirely. A significant number of abandoned or underused Victorian stations have found new purposes that allow their architectural grandeur to be preserved and enjoyed without the impossible burden of meeting contemporary rail operational standards. Hotels are perhaps the most glamorous of these second lives. The Midland Grand Hotel at St. Pancras was itself a famous conversion. Ironically, the hotel that had been purpose-built as part of the original station complex was later shut as a hotel, used as railway offices, and then painstakingly restored to its original hotel function as part of the wider regeneration project. In the United States, Union Station in Denver, Union Station in Washington, D.C., and several others have been transformed into hotel and retail complexes, preserving the grandeur of the original buildings while generating the commercial revenues necessary to sustain their maintenance. Museums are another successful adaptation. The old Musée d'Orsay in Paris, originally built as a terminus for the Paris-Orléans Railway in Ijou-Lingling and closed to rail traffic in 1939, was converted into one of the world's great art museums in the 1980s. Its vast nave, which once sheltered steam locomotives, now houses Impressionist and Post-Impressionist paintings in one of the most dramatically beautiful museum spaces in the world. The conversion was not without difficulty, but the result has been an overwhelming cultural and commercial success. Markets, event spaces, and retail centers have also absorbed former railway stations, particularly smaller examples. A station building might become a weekend market, a concert venue, or a food hall. These uses preserve the building, generate some income, and allow the public to enjoy the architecture, though they can feel somewhat anticlimactic given the original ambition of the structures involved. The lesson from these successful conversions is that historic stations can survive and thrive when they are allowed to serve functions appropriate to their actual architecture, rather than being forced to conform to operational requirements for which they were never designed. The challenge is that this pragmatic solution requires accepting that the railway has left the building, and that may be a harder cultural concession to make than it appears. Path forward, engineering, creativity, and the Madrid model. Despite the formidable obstacles, there are reasons to believe that the apparently irreconcilable conflict between historic station architecture and modern rail operation is not entirely without solutions. The key insight is that the most creative approaches decouple the heritage building from the operational infrastructure, allowing each to exist and function on its own terms. Madrid's Atocha station offers one compelling model: the original 1892 iron and glass station building. A magnificent example of late 19th century railway architecture was preserved and converted into a tropical garden and event space. Meanwhile, high-speed rail operations were relocated to a modern underground terminus constructed beneath the historic structure. The new station is entirely contemporary in its design and specification, capable of handling the longest and fastest trains in the Spanish network, while the old station sits above it, preserved and celebrated as the architectural jewel it always was. This subsurface approach, constructing new operational infrastructure beneath or beside historic structures, rather than attempting to retrofit within them, represents perhaps the most technically sophisticated response to the problem. It is also, inevitably, extremely expensive. Tunneling beneath an existing city in the vicinity of a historic listed building requires extraordinary care to avoid settlement damage, and the engineering challenges are immense. But where the political will and the investment funding align, it can produce outcomes that preserve both the heritage value and the operational performance that modern rail requires. Other approaches include using historic station buildings as above-ground passenger terminals, ticketing, retail, waiting areas, and passenger services, while the actual platforms and train operations are conducted on extended or rebuilt structures immediately adjacent. The historic facade and concourse become the public face of the station, while operational areas are handled in spaces that can be built to modern specifications without heritage constraints. This is roughly what has been achieved at several major European termini, where historic street frontages mask thoroughly modern platform arrangements behind them. Digital technology offers additional possibilities. Virtual heritage interpretation using augmented reality, high-quality displays, and interactive installations can allow the public to experience the history and architectural significance of a station building even when the building itself is performing a quite different function. The railway heritage can be honored and communicated without requiring the building to literally operate as a Victorian station. The weight of beauty. The story of why railways refuse to use their most beautiful historic stations is ultimately a story about the weight of beauty, the extraordinary burden that architectural magnificence imposes on those responsible for maintaining, adapting, and operating it. These stations were built to last, and they have lasted. But they have lasted into a world that has changed far more radically than their creators could have anticipated. The platforms are too short, the curves too tight, the structures too constrained, the regulations too complex, and the costs too vast. And yet something important is at stake in how we respond to these buildings. They are not merely pretty objects or tourist attractions. They are physical expressions of the ambition, the confidence, and the civic culture of the societies that built them. When we look at the soaring roof of a great Victorian terminus, or run our hands along the polished marble of its booking hall, we are touching the material record of a moment when railways seemed to promise a transformed world faster, more connected, more democratic in their reach, than anything that had come before. That promise was not entirely unfulfilled, and these buildings are its monuments. The most satisfying answers to the problem of historic stations are those that refuse the false choice between preservation and progress. Madrid's underground terminus beneath the Atasha Garden, St. Pancras's painstaking billion-pound transformation, the Musée d'Orsay's reinvention as a temple of art. All of these demonstrate that with sufficient imagination, investment, and patience, it is possible to honor the past without sacrificing the future. What these examples also share, however, is the scale of commitment they required. They were not achieved cheaply, quickly, or without controversy. They demanded that governments, railway operators, heritage bodies, and communities make a collective decision. That decision is a political and cultural one, not a technical one, and it is not made automatically in favor of preservation. As railway networks continue to modernize with longer trains, higher speeds, digital signaling, and rising passenger expectations, the pressure on historic station infrastructure will only increase. The gap between what these buildings were designed for and what contemporary operations demand will continue to widen. Without deliberate intervention, more of these grand terminals will be bypassed, converted, or in the worst cases, simply allowed to decay. The railways did not refuse to use historic stations out of indifference or contempt. They did so because the mathematics of modern rail operation leave little room for sentiment, and because the cost of reconciling the past with the present is almost always higher than anyone initially imagines. But the best examples of successful regeneration remind us that the cost of doing nothing, of allowing these extraordinary buildings to slip irretrievably from their original purpose and eventually from living memory, may be higher still. The question of what to do with our magnificent, impractical, irreplaceable railway stations is, in the end, a question about what kind of relationship we want to have with our own history. And that is a question worth the investment of serious thought, serious money, and serious ambition.